Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, Co-President and co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And today, our topic is activism to reject Christian nationalism at the local level. And I'll be joined by two such local or state activists talking about how it can actually be a lot of fun to reject Christian nationalism. And you can participate by asking questions or making comments in the Facebook comments or email askanatheist@ffrf.org. And I'd like to welcome our two guests and activists who are joining remotely from the Twin Cities. First, I'd like to introduce Humanists of Minnesota President Ellie Haylund. Ellie also serves as co-chair of the marketing team, and you're going to learn more about that in a minute. She's been involved with the organization since 2015 and is passionate about bringing visibility to the concept of humanism and cultivating the next generation of humanists. So Ellie, welcome to our program.
Hi, thank you for having us. This is really wonderful.
And then I'd like to introduce our next guest. This is someone who's also written an op-ed about Christian nationalism, and joining our show today will be Humanists of Minnesota board member Suzanne Perry. Suzanne's a retired journalist who worked for publications in Minnesota, Brussels, and D.C., and she coordinates the annual event at the Minnesota State Capitol celebrating the Day of Reason. So thank you for being here today, Suzanne.
Very happy to be here.
So first, I'd like to talk about the billboard that Humanists Minnesota recently put up, and we do have some photographs of that you'll be seeing on the screen. And Ellie, was this billboard put up in St. Paul?
So this was our first billboard campaign, and this was last year. This was just the Good Without a God campaign, and we had two of the billboards, and they were both in Minneapolis, actually. So this was a little bit more promoting the concept of humanism versus our campaign this year that was more for advocacy for separation of church and state.
So can we see that billboard, Bruce? We've got that on the screen, I think, about Christian nationalism. And while we get that up, can you tell me more about that billboard and what prompted it and what the reaction's been?
Yeah, so this campaign this year, we had two billboards, both in St. Paul near the state capitol. And as you can see, one said, protect our democracy, keep religion out of government. And the other one, the more, I would say, controversial billboard, that one, we called it out a little more specifically, reject Christian nationalism. It was important for us to kind of find, like I was saying, an advocacy angle with this one. Obviously, by way of that, it's creating visibility for our organization, but the most important thing here was to bring attention to this issue that we're seeing across the country that's a large threat to democracy. And so we spent a lot of time working on the messaging. We weren't trying to be controversial, but we also didn't want to mince words and kind of be subtle when it's pretty clear what we needed to say.
So is this billboard still up?
I think it's down now. We had them up from March to May, so we had 3 months. It was actually really exciting. Our board had approved the funding for 2 months, and then we did a fundraiser for the third month so that it could run up until our Day of Reason event. And it was hugely successful, which was really great because, you know, we want to do these things, but we want to make sure that people want them done, that they see value in it. You know, sometimes people think billboards are helpful, not helpful, good investment, not good investment. And so having that feedback that people wanted that message to be out there in that format was very heartening and encouraging for us to continue that.
So you can see that you started it in March because there's snow, then we see it in the spring. So I know you had good reaction, but there was also an article about it in the Star Tribune, wasn't there?
Yes. So we wrote a press release. You know, we kind of wanted to approach this from a formal, professional way. And so we submitted the press release to the Faith and Spirituality reporter at the Star Tribune. And so she did, and we interviewed with her. She was wonderful. She wrote this article, and it made quite a splash. I think the comment section had like 700 comments, and that's far more than you usually see. So obviously on both sides, this was something people had a lot to say about.
So then before we talk about Christian nationalism, could you tell viewers what secular humanism is and why you identify as one? And were you always non-religious?
Yeah, so I think around the age of 15 or so, I realized that religion and the concept of a higher power didn't resonate with me. I called myself agnostic, but if I was being more honest, I think I align more with atheism. And then in college, I came across the concept of humanism, which is being a good person and doing good without the influence of a higher power. So most humanists probably consider themselves atheist, but they prefer to define themselves by what they are versus what they aren't. And so they kind of like to stay in that realm of no God, now what? What do I believe in? The goodness of people being good for the sake of the common good.
So I do want to get to Suzanne, but before we do, could you say what prompted your humanist group to put up this particular billboard against Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so one of our kind of core principles is separation of church and state, because that's important for all people. It's not an attack on religion. It's in the Constitution. And so that's always been something that we care about, but we've kind of been mobilized to get more involved politically because of what we're seeing around the country. It's encouraged us to act because there are things we can do. We don't need to be complacent, and it just really resonates with the values of humanists. And so it felt important for us to do what we could. And Suzanne will talk more about it, but at a government level, we've also gotten involved. So we kind of are trying these different angles to live those principles.
So now, Suzanne, I'd like to welcome you back and ask first, you too, about your personal views as a secular humanist before we get into the weeds of this campaign.
Okay. I was raised Catholic, and in roughly high school, I started questioning the Catholic religion. And eventually that led to me questioning religion in general. So I was probably an atheist by the time I was in college, but I was a journalist for a big part of my career, so I couldn't really do advocacy. And I've been involved with Humanists MN, for about 8 or 9 years now. And when I joined, one of my top priorities was to fight for separation of church and state. So I'm really happy that we've become so active in this area.
Well, we're the beneficiaries of your retirement.
Yeah.
So you co-authored, an op-ed with Stephanie Schwinn that's called Christian Nationalism, a Threat to Democracy, which is certainly the case. And that appeared, about 2 weeks ago or in May in the Minnesota Reformer. So before we talk about that op-ed, can you first define what Christian nationalism means?
Well, it means that people are saying that we were founded as a Christian country and that the government should take steps to keep it that way. So in other words, Christianity should be privileged, have a privileged status in our society. And it's sort of a merger of Christianity with civic life, which we reject as violating the First Amendment of the Constitution.
So your op-ed, which was excellent, mentions how Christian nationalism is now being openly embraced by some prominent public officials, and your article quotes Nick Fuentes, for example, the white Christian nationalist who dined last year with former President Trump, saying, and I think this is on the screen, we're having something like Taliban rule in America, but in a good way. First, do you want to comment on that good way? I mean, this is sort of ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's come out about Christian nationalism in recent years, I mean, the the religious right has always been with us. But I think what's happening now is that it's being merged with this idea that Christians should take over the government. And that involves, of course, the repression of women, repression of LGBTQ people. And I think we got especially disturbed in terms of what led up to this billboard after the January 6th insurrection. And there were so many influences of Christian nationalism there, from the Bible readings to the photos of Jesus merged with Trump, crosses, flags. And so I think it's taken a step in a more dangerous direction. And of course, if someone like Nick Fuentes is having dinner with former President Trump, these people are kind of being brought into the establishment, at least of the right wing. And that's really disturbing.
And, you know, if people want to see evidence of the Christian nationalism on January 6th, of course, FFRF and the Baptist Joint Committee did a joint report. You can Google it, January 6th Joint Report, FFRF, BJC, and you can find it. And Suzanne, you also quote the Fuentes' colleague, who's white supremacist Vincent James Fox. We also have this quote on the screen saying, "We will not stop until the Handmaid's Tale is a reality." So that is really scary. And of course, we're seeing this happen before our eyes with the curtailment of abortion rights. And in fact, you end your piece by saying that we should believe Fox, that this is a serious threat. Did you want to elaborate?
I mean, I think you're right that even a couple years ago, I'm not sure we could have predicted that the Supreme Court would overturn overturn the constitutional right to abortion. People feared it, but I think when it became a reality, it really shook people up. And of course, that does make you think of other societies that repress women. So I think one thing that played into our decision to go public with these billboards is the Supreme Court more and more giving preference to religious dogma in their rulings. And of course, the abortion ruling is a prime example, but there have been many others that have to do with, prayer in schools and vouchers to religious schools, that kind of thing. So things can happen that even a few years ago might have seemed, in the realm of improbable. We feared it, but now it's becoming reality.
Well, we now see the whole South has fallen to the anti-abortionists, with the exception of Virginia, and now they're hard at work to ban abortion there. So it's really grim. And of course, here in Wisconsin, it's banned. Thankfully, not there in Minnesota. You're doing things right.
Yeah, I mean, we're lucky to live in Minnesota for now because the government is taking steps to protect transgender people seeking abortions. We've become a refuge state, and that's really encouraging. But we don't want to get too complacent, because the reason that's happening is that Democrats control all three arms of the government, and that might not last forever. So we are on guard for the tendencies in other states to infringe here.
Yeah, good idea. I want to get back to some of the Minnesota politics, but you mentioned in your piece how we can see the influence of Christian nationalism in these various legislative campaigns. And do you want to talk a little bit about those inroads?
Well, one thing I'd like to mention, we haven't mentioned it so far, is that last fall, a bunch of legislators formed something called a secular government caucus. And one of the reasons we put up the billboards were to support them. And they are modeled on the congressional Free Thought Caucus. They're legislators who want to stand up for the principle of separation of church and state, secular lawmaking. There are about 28 of them. Now, they were set up partly to counter the Legislative Prayer Caucus. So we do have sort of Christian nationalist types in the legislature. And when they issued their press release announcing the Secular Caucus, they specifically called out a couple of things that the Prayer Caucus had tried to do. One was to have all public schools display the In God We Trust motto. And another was to threaten the funding of the Minnesota Historical Society because they had dared to have an author speak there who sort of was debunking the idea that we were founded as a Christian nation. So since then, they've been relatively quiet, I think because Democrats are in control. But we had a case just recently where 2 Christian colleges sued the state because the legislature passed a law that said that colleges that require faith statements cannot get state money to offer high school students college credit. So they have sued and said we're discriminating, or the state is discriminating against them. Not that they're discriminating against non-Christian students. Right. State's discriminating against them. And the Secular Caucus, for the first time since it started, got together and issued a press release countering that argument and defending the law. So we were happy to see they got right on top of that.
Yeah, and we have a representative, I think it's Mike Freiberg, will be speaking at a panel at FFRF's 46th annual convention that's here in Madison, Wisconsin this October.
Yeah.
We're having a panel of secular legislators, so we'll be glad to meet him. We've talked with him.
He's one of our champions, yeah.
So there's also something called a New Rights, Faith, and Democracy Minnesota Coalition. And can either of you talk about what that is and what their mission is?
Yeah, that's actually part of a nationwide movement to unite groups that are fighting for LGBTQ rights, especially, but other kinds of rights. In our state, a group called Out Front Minnesota is leading this effort. And the idea is to sort of reclaim religion from the Christian nationalists. And they've worked with us a bit. A couple of their members participated in our National Day of Reason event at the Capitol, and we're hoping to step up cooperation with them a bit more as time goes by.
Yeah, so Amanda Tyler is the president of Baptist Joint Committee, and she also chairs Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and she'll be receiving an award at our convention in October.
Oh.
So
right.
We're looking forward. I've worked with her, but I haven't met her in person yet, so looking forward to seeing her. So is there anything either of you would like to add or that we didn't get to yet before we go to some questions and comments?
Suzanne, did you want to talk a little bit about the Day of Reason, just in terms of some of our advocacy and government work?
Yeah.
Or I can share.
This is something we've stepped up over the years. We have a big event at the Capitol where we invite legislators, and Mike Freiberg is one of our champions at these events. And we also include advocacy groups to show that Christian nationalism or religious dogma can be harmful to many different groups, whether it's people seeking abortion, transgender people, Jews. That after the last Day of Reason event a year ago, it went so well that's when we came up with the idea of the Secular Caucus in the legislature. But I did want to add one more thing. That Star Tribune article led to a huge influx of new members.
I was going to mention that too.
Oh, go ahead, Ellie. Talk about that.
So almost immediately after the article came out, besides, the comments and the likes online, the billboard went kind of viral on Reddit. We immediately started seeing members rolling in, and I believe we've gained over 75, which we've been around for 36 years. I think we had been at, what was it, Suzanne, 300 members prior to that? So that's a really big percentage increase. And people were listing the article as the thing that drove them to it, or the billboards. And that was really wonderful to see because, again, as I was saying earlier, you want to do these things because they're important to the organization, but also because they're what people want to see. And so seeing that people not only liked our message and resonated with that, they liked the work that we were doing and saw value in it, so they wanted to become dues-paying members. So that encourages us to keep doing these things and continue this activism work because people see a need for it. And so to get that kind of response from an action that we took was really wonderful and has given us a lot of energy to keep this momentum going.
And anything else you wanted to add, Suzanne?
We also got a bunch of newsletter subscribers. And one thing I'll mention just along those lines is most of the comments in the article, the 700 comments, were positive. And occasionally people would come in and challenge what we were doing, and the commenters would come back and defend us. And I guess what that tells us is there are a lot of people out there who are frustrated and looking for groups to stand up to Christian nationalism and religious influence in public policy.
Well, we're glad you are, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation certainly is. And so I think that we have some questions from our audience. I'm going to start with a question saying, what are some small things that I can do right now to deter Christian nationalism in my town? One of you want to take that?
Well, I think anybody can write an op-ed, especially in smaller towns. It might be easier to get it published. A letter to the editor. I understand in smaller towns, a lot of times the problem is with school boards, city councils. So paying attention to what they're doing, a lot of school boards are really under siege and would appreciate any support you can give them.
Yeah, I was going to say voting, paying attention to the local elections, because that's really where they're concentrating. Well, they're concentrating on all the elections, but including school boards, especially with all these bans. And Elle, I'm sorry, is it Elle or Ellie?
Ellie.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Ellie, did you have anything to add about that?
Well, this seems a little obscure, but I just thought of it. I went to the American Humanists Association annual conference in May. And I was talking to some people that are involved in other humanist organizations around the country. And there's a woman that I spoke with that's a part of the Central Florida Freethinkers. And, we've been getting involved in, the state legislature, right? One thing I would mention is that our program coordinator, Audrey Kingstrom, she was invited by Representative Mike Freiberg to do a secular invocation before the House session. Usually that's a chaplain or a minister that comes and does that prayer at the beginning of every session. She was invited to do a secular one. And so anyway, it was interesting because this woman from Central Florida, she said that they do that, but like at small town sessions for whatever local government, they ask permission to come in and do these secular invocations regularly. And that seems a little obscure, but I think they like to do that because it gives them visibility. It gives them a platform to kind of connect with local politicians, normalize their view, but then they have kind of this to start, especially in a place like Florida, find allies figure out things they can do and create these relationships. And I thought that was really interesting that even in, small towns in Florida, they're doing those kinds of things to create that visibility and also form those partnerships. So,
well, I'm suspecting that was Jocelyn Williamson, and because that Central Florida Freethinkers is our chapter there in Orlando, and in fact, we had to sue with that chapter and other people in Broward County, Florida, in order to get a secular invocation. Well, actually, they ended up banishing invocations altogether, which was fine.
Oh, wow.
We don't think there should be invocations. We only do them ourselves to counter them.
Exactly, but, yes.
Yeah, I was going to also say, that FFRF has started a C4 group called FFRF Action Fund. And if you are on our list, then you get action alerts about legislation in your state or federally that affects you. And we'd love to have someone be an advocate, and but you can just do that at no cost. You can go to that website, and of course there's many other groups that do action alerts as well. And calling on your legislator when they are a representative or senators at their home district, terribly important. And writing those letters to the editor, which are even easier than op-eds, really they do count those. Legislative aides will look and see if there's an issue being talked about in a newspaper. So there's a lot of things somebody can do as an individual activist, and certainly joining your local and national groups, you should do that too, because we'll keep you posted. And then there's a number of questions. Here's one that says, how do you continue to persevere when sometimes it seems like all doom and gloom? And I'm going to just briefly say, well, if we don't persevere, it's going to get a lot more doomier and gloomier. So what's the alternative? But how would both of you answer that, Suzanne and Ellie?
Well, I understand the sentiment. Like I said, we're somewhat buffered from that in Minnesota. Because we do have these signs of light, like the Secular Government Caucus and our Democratic legislature and governor making us a refuge state and that kind of thing. So I would be interested. I don't know if anybody in your audience might want to make a comment about that, about living in a really red state where things are horrible. What are their tactics?
Well, I could say it.
Okay.
We have a Democratic governor, but a Republican bloc in the legislature. And one thing that's happened in Wisconsin, and we have talked about this in Ask an Atheist, is that there was a pro-choice person who was voted in on our Wisconsin State Supreme Court, which is a game changer for the litigation that's going up, challenging our 1849 ban on abortion, for example. Or if you just look at the news today, another court struck down, I think it was Florida, struck down one of the Don't Say Gay or bans there. We saw the drag queen ban in Tennessee struck down by court. FFRF is working with a coalition of national groups, and we'll be suing over that terrible Oklahoma charter school that the Catholic Church has been scheming to start. They want to do this all over the country, to have public charter schools that are completely religious and sectarian, paid with taxpayer money. So when you work with FFRF and you join these groups, this is one of the things that we're able to do, is to sue. And we have to protest, and we have to try to stop it. And there are successful litigation on abortion. Every week I see another lawsuit that's being taken by the Reproductive Rights Center or other groups. We have to fight back. Otherwise we are going to lose our democracy. And that really would make me gloomy. But Ellie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that the humanist in me tries to keep a positive outlook. We're doing what we can. Organizations like yours, all of these organizations that are doing these things, it gives me hope because there are so many people united together on this. Like you guys, we all know the rise in nuns, the non-religious, and seeing that shows me that despite the impact that Christian nationalists have, that feels like that's growing, it's not proportionate to the amount of religious people. There are not more and more Christians every year. There are more and more unaffiliated. And so I have hope that despite the disproportionate influence that Christian nationalism has, as we see these secular people become more visible, feel more comfortable showing who they are, whether they're legislators or just regular people, that will win out. And so that's me, trying to be an optimist. Inside, I'm not always an optimist, but if I say it enough, maybe I'll believe it.
Well, I mean, what you say is true. There are actually more religiously unaffiliated nuns. They're not all atheists and agnostics or secular humanists, but they have no religious affiliation. Then there are white Christian evangelicals. Right. So there are more of us than them. They've managed to get disproportionate power in many legislatures, and unfortunately, the judiciary has been packed. But we are seeing Biden appointing many judges too. So you're absolutely right. We just have to flex our secular muscle more. There are still more questions. What are the most common tactics Christian nationalists use to gain support, and how can I counter them? Kind of a repetition of that first question, perhaps. Maybe Suzanne wants to talk about that.
Well, we got a very negative response to our op-ed from a group called Restore Minnesota. And it was basically saying, just in terms of tactics that they used, it was basically saying that it's not true that we weren't created as a Christian nation, that our founders wanted Jesus to influence the founding of the country, and that's why we're such a great country. And how can you make a great country if you don't believe in God? So I think it helps to kind of be familiar with the tactics that they use in terms of trying to persuade people and being able to counter them. I mean, FFRF has some great material. We've had Andrew Seidel come to talk to us about Christian nationalism and about the Supreme Court, and just having a sort of knowledge of history and politics, I think is helpful.
Ellie, did you want to add anything?
That's everything I would have said. I think, speaking to the response that she talked about from Restore Minnesota, they were really aggressive toward us. Like she said, they were saying that you can't be a good person without God. And I think that kind of that reductive argument seems like something that they say, and then that's just end of story. And so to kind of devolve to that feels like an easy thing to respond to and say, well, then why am I a good person? Why do I do good things when I don't have a God? So it's kind of interesting when that gets brought up, especially at a government level. But yeah, that's kind of my contribution.
Well, that is kind of the big libel, or that's the big myth that FFRF we've had to counter for 45 years. But I guess the other one is the big lie that we are a Christian nation. And so bad history makes bad law, we have found. And so as individuals, when we see that lie, the big lie that this is a Christian nation, we can, as individuals, counter that, whether it's in a conversation or a letter to the editor or at the polls. There are ways to educate and fight back against that. It is truly a big lie. And there is one more question. Now I've lost it. Well, just 1 second. I think we're going to end with this question to both of you. What accomplishment are you most proud of so far with your activism?
Well, I think it's learning. Well, we're very proud of the Secular Government Caucus, That took some work and building relationships over the years. And like I said, we're just starting to see the fruition of that with their first statement. But I think also just finding all the new members who may not have known we were out there and now do know we're out there. And we just have to keep finding them.
Yeah, I agree. I think the membership growth that we had, I'm really proud of because it was twofold, like I kind of touched on before. People joined because they liked to see what we were doing and they wanted to financially support us. But it wasn't just about that. It was that humanism resonated with them and they felt like this was the right place for them. And that's always been kind of an uphill battle for us is when you tell people about humanism, so many people you speak with say, that sounds like me. I just didn't know there was a name for it. And I think to give people the opportunity to find that community and find, a way to define themselves that feels at home that they never had. I loved so much that the membership growth from the article and the billboards accomplished those two really great things for advocacy and then also for people to find community. That was really wonderful and special for us.
Well, I think billboard campaigns can be great fun and very educational, and I want to thank both of you for joining me today and for your activism.
Very happy to be here.
Yes, thank you so much. This was great.
And if you're interested in free thought programming, you can also tune into FFRF's Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and I speak to First Amendment legend Ellie about the upcoming 60th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision Abington versus Schempp against Bible reading and reciting the Lord's Prayer in public schools. You can listen to Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to catch the latest episode of the We Dissent podcast, women attorneys working for secular organizations, including FFRF's Rebecca Market and Liz Cavell, talking about the history of the Establishment Clause and threats to it, with the fascinating Professor Carolyn Corbin, Professor of Law at the University of Miami. She was on the program in May to talk about abortion rights, this program, about abortion rights in the Dobbs decision. So thank you for watching. If you are an FFRF member, thank you. If not, we'd love to send you or email you information, including a copy of our newspaper, Free Thought Today, so you can get better acquainted with FFRF's vital work to educate the public about non-theism and keep religion out of government. Ask for more information or join us today at ffrf.org and see you next week.